The Song dynasty in China was a leading example of diversity and innovation in Afro-Eurasia and the Americas during the 13th century. China enjoyed great wealth, political stability, and fine artistic and intellectual achievements. Neo-Confucian teaching supported the government and shaped social classes and the family system. In addition, China developed the greatest manufacturing capability in the world. However, the spread of Confucianism and Buddhism might be the most important enduring testimony to Chinese influence. The Song dynasty replaced the Tang in 960 and ruled for more than 3 centuries. They lost control of northern lands to invading nomads from Manchuria who set up the Zhen Empire. Although the Song ruled a smaller region than the Tang, their reign was prosperous, and under them the arts flourished. China's strength was partially the result of its imperial bureaucracy, a vast organization in which appointed officials carried out the empire's policies. The bureaucracy had been a feature of Chinese government since the Qin dynasty in 221 BCE. It represented a continuity across centuries and dynasties. Under the Song, China's bureaucracy expanded. Early in the dynasty, this strengthened the dynasty. One of the Song's greatest achievement was that they expanded educational opportunities to young men of the lower economic classes, so they could score well on a civil service exam. By scoring well, a young man could move up in the class system. These exams were based on knowledge of Confucian texts. Because officials obtained their position by demonstrating their merit on these exams, China's bureaucratic system was known as a meritocracy. Through this, the poor was vastly underrepresented in the bureaucracy, and the Chinese system only allowed for more upward mobility than any other hiring system of its time, but yet it was still restrictive. However, by the end of the Song dynasty, the bureaucracy had grown so large that it contributed to the empire's weakness. By creating so many jobs and by paying these officials so well, the Song increased the cost of government to the point that they began drying up China's surplus wealth. The flourishing Tang dynasty had successfully promoted agricultural development, improved roads and canals, encouraged foreign trade, and spread technology. These accomplishments led to rapid prosperity and population growth during the Song dynasty. The Grand Canal was an inexpensive and efficient internal waterway transportation system that extended over 30,000 miles. Expanding the canal enabled China under the Song dynasty to become the most populous trading area in the world. Although gunpowder had been invented in China in previous dynasties, innovators in the Song dynasty made the first guns. Over centuries, the technology of making gunpowder and guns spread from China to all parts of Eurasia via traders on the Silk Road. Sometime before the 11th century, Champa rice, a fast-ripening and drought-resistant strain of rice from the Champa Kingdom in present-day Vietnam, greatly expanded agricultural production in China. This rice and other strains developed through experimentation allowed farming to spread to lands where once rice could not grow, such as lowlands, riverbanks, and hills. In some areas, it allowed farmers to grow 2 crops of rice per year, a summer crop and a winter crop. Innovative methods of production contributed to agricultural success. For example, Chinese farmers put manure on the fields to enrich the soil. They built elaborate irrigation systems using ditches, water wheels, pumps, and terrace to increase productivity. The combination of these changes in agricultural practices produced an abundance of food. As a result, China's population grew quickly. In the 3 centuries of the Song dynasty, China's population increased from about 25% of the total world population to nearly 40%. Industrial production soared, as did China's population. China's discovery of black earth coal in the 4th century BCE enabled it to produce greater amounts of cast iron goods. Through massive use of coal to power machines wouldn't happen until the 18th century. China did have the greatest manufacturing capability in the world. Under the Song and earlier than in Western Europe, China experienced proto-industrialization, a set of economic changes in which people in rural areas made more goods than they could sell. Unlike later industrialization, which featured large-scale production in factories using complex machinery, proto-industrialization relied more on home-based or community-based production using simple equipment. The song also promoted the growth of commercial economy by changing how they built public projects such as roads and irrigation canals. Instead of requiring that people labor on these projects, the government paid people to work on them. This change increased the amount of money in circulation, promoting economic growth. Another source of income for the government came from the tributary system, an arrangement in which other states had to pay money or provide goods to honor the Chinese emperor. This system cemented China's economic and political power over several foreign countries, but it also created stability and stimulated trade for all parties involved. The origin of the system existed in the Han Dynasty, but by the time of the Song Dynasty, Japan, Korea, and kingdoms throughout Southeast Asia were tributary states. The emperor expected representatives from tributary states to demonstrate their respect by performing a kowtow, a ritual in which anyone greeting the Chinese emperor must bow his or her head until it reached the floor. Throughout most of Chinese history, the majority of people lived in rural areas. However, urban areas grew in importance during this productive period. At the height of the Song Dynasty, China was the most urbanized land in the world, boasting several cities containing more than 100,000 people. Though urbanization represented a significant development in China, life in rural areas grew more complex as well. The bureaucratic expansion created an entirely new social class, the scholar gentry. They soon outnumbered the aristocracy, which was comprised of landowners who inherited their wealth. The scholar gentry were educated in Confucian philosophy and became the most influential social class in China. Three other classes ranked below the scholar gentry: farmers, artisans, and merchants. The low status of merchants reflected Confucian respect for hard work and creating value. The tasks of a merchant did not require physical strength or endurance, and they simply exchanged goods without growing or making anything new. Lower rungs of Chinese society included peasants who worked for the wealthy, landowners, and often to pay off debts, and the urban poor. The Song government provided aid to the poor and established public hospitals where people could receive free care. Confucian traditions included both respect for women and the expectation that they would defer to men. The patriarchal pattern strengthened during the Tang and Song dynasties. One distinctive constraint on women's activities in China was the practice of foot binding, which became common among aristocratic families during the Song dynasty. From a very young age, girls had their feet wrapped so tightly that the bones did not grow naturally. A bound foot signified social status, something suitors particularly desired. It also restricted women's ability to move and hence to participate in the public sphere. Foot binding was finally banned in 1912. The Chinese had invented paper as early as the 2nd century CE, and they developed a system of printing in the 7th century. They were the first culture to use woodblock printing. A Buddhist scripture produced in the 7th century is thought to be the world's first woodblock painted work. In the Song era, printed booklets on how to farm efficiently were distributed throughout rice-growing regions. The development of paper and printing expanded the availability of books. Though most peasants were illiterate, China's privileged classes had increased access to literature. Confucian scholars not only consumed literature at a tremendous rate, they were also the major producers of literature throughout the era. Buddhism had come to China from its birthplace in India via the Silk Roads. Its presence is evident during the anarchic period between the later Han and the Sui dynasties. However, its popularity became widespread during the Tang dynasty. The 7th century Buddhist monk Xuanzang helped build Buddhism's popularity in China. Three forms of Buddhism from India came to shape Asia, each developing a different emphasis. Theravada Buddhism focused on personal spiritual growth through silent meditation and self-discipline. It became strongest in Southeast Asia. Mahayana Buddhism focused on spiritual growth for all beings and on service. It became strongest in China and Korea. Tibetan Buddhism focused on chanting. It became strongest in Tibet. All three include a belief in the Four Noble Truths, which stress the idea that personal suffering can be alleviated by eliminating cravings or desires and by following Buddhist theories. All three also embrace the Eightfold Path, including right speech, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, that can lead to the enlightenment or nirvana. The Song dynasty was somewhat more friendly towards Buddhism, but it did not go out of its way to promote the religion. It preferred to emphasize China's native traditions, such as Confucianism. However, Buddhism had a strong presence, and many Confucians began to adopt its ideals into their daily lives. The development of printing had made Buddhist scriptures widely available to the Confucian scholar gentry. The Song dynasty benefited from the Confucian ideal of family piety, the duty of family members to subordinate their desires to those of the male head of the family and to the ruler. The emphasis on respect for one's elders helped the Song maintain their rule in China. Neo-Confucianism evolved in China between 770 and 840. It was a syncretic system, combining rational thought with the more abstract ideas of Taoism and Buddhism. This new incarnation of Confucianism emphasized ethics rather than the mysteries of God and nature. It became immensely popular in countries in China's orbit, including Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. An important dynamic in the histories of Japan, Korea, and Vietnam was each country's relationship with China. When China was unified, its political strength, economic wealth, religious traditions, intellectual advances, and technological innovations made the world's most powerful country. Its smaller neighbors benefited from being so close to China, but faced a challenge of maintaining their own distinctive cultures. Each had to confront the issue of assimilation of Chinese traditions and practices. Since Japan was separated from China by sea rather than land, it had more ability to control its interactions with China than Korea or Vietnam could. The impact of Chinese culture appeared in many aspects of life. For instance, they promoted Buddhism and Confucianism along with Japan's traditional Shinto religion. During the Heian period, Japan emulated Chinese traditions in politics, art, and literature. However, Japanese writers also moved in new directions. For example, in the 11th century, a Japanese writer composed the world's first novel, The Tale of Genji. It is a story of a Japanese prince and his life at court, particularly his many romances. For hundreds of years, Japan had been a feudal society without a centralized government. Landowning aristocrats called the daimyo battled for control of land, while the majority of people worked as rice farmers. Japanese feudalism was similar to European feudalism, which is described later. Both featured very little social mobility, and both systems were built upon hereditary hierarchies. In Japan, peasants, known as serfs, were born into lives of economic dependency, while samurai were born into their roles as protectors, and daimyo were born into lives of privilege. In Europe, the three groups were serfs, knights, and nobles. What distinguishes Japanese feudalism from that of Europe was that the daimyo enjoyed much more power than the nobility in Europe did. The daimyo ruled over vast stretches of land and in reality were more powerful than either the emperor or the shogun. By contrast, Europeans' hierarchy placed the monarch above the nobility. In Europe, the ideal knight held to a coat of chivalry, with duty to countrymen, duty to God, and duty to women, the last expressed through courtly love, and the virtues of gentleness and graciousness. In Japan, the code was known as Bushido and stressed frugality, loyalty, and martial arts, and honor unto death. Korea's location gave it a very direct relationship with China. The countries shared a land boundary, and China extended both the north and to the south of Korea. Through its tributary relationship, Korea and China were in close contact. Thus, Korea emulated many aspects of China's politics and culture. It centralized its government in the style of the Chinese. Culturally, Koreans adopted both Confucian and Buddhist beliefs. The educated elite studied Confucian classics, while Buddhist doctrine attracted the peasant masses. Koreans adapted the Chinese writing system, which proved to be very awkward. The Chinese and Korean language remained structurally very different. In the 15th century, Korea developed its own writing system. One important difference between Korea and China was that the landed aristocracy were more powerful in Korea than in China. As a result, the Korean elite were able to prevent certain Chinese reforms from ever being implemented. For example, though there was a Korean civil service examination, it was not open to peasants. Thus, there was no truly merit-based system for entering the bureaucracy. Like Japan and Korea, Vietnam traded with and learned from China. For example, Vietnam adapted the Chinese writing system and architectural styles. However, Vietnam had a more adversarial relationship with China. At times, the Vietnamese launched violent rebellions against Chinese influence. Vietnamese culture differed from Chinese culture in several ways, which explains the strong resistance to Chinese power. For example, Vietnamese women enjoyed greater independence in their married lives than did Chinese women in the Confucian tradition. While the Chinese lived in extended families, the Vietnamese preferred nuclear families. Vietnamese villages operated independently of a national government. Political centralization was non-existent. Although Vietnam adopted a merit-based bureaucracy for educated men, the Vietnamese system did not function like the Chinese scholar bureaucracy. Instead of loyalty to the emperor, scholar officials in Vietnam owed more allegiance to the village peasants. In fact, Vietnamese scholar officials often led revolts against the government if they deemed it too oppressive. Vietnamese women resented their inferior status under the Chinese. In particular, they rejected the customs of foot binding and polygamy, the practice of having more than one wife at the same time. In spite of Vietnamese efforts to maintain the purity of their own culture, sinification did occur. As the Tang dynasty began to crumble in the 8th century, Vietnamese rebels pushed out China's occupying army. In their battles against the Chinese, they showed a strong capacity for guerrilla warfare, perhaps due to their deep knowledge of their own land.